Good evening there, everybody. What is happening? Hopefully, y'all are having a wonderful day today. So, when it comes down to it, I thought, of course, that I would talk about this little video that I found to be very particularly interesting. And this is going to be a video overall, I believe, by that of ProBox TV, where, of course, both Paulie Malignaggi and Chris Algieri, two former champions within that of professional boxing, they usually end up talking about some sort of topic on that of their particular show or their particular podcast. Well, I thought that this one was very particularly interesting because they're going to be recently talking about Terence Bud Crawford, and apparently there is recent buzzing around the rumor mill right now that there's a possibility that Terence Bud Crawford, or at least that many people believe that there's a possibility that Terence Crawford may not fight again unless he gets the Canelo Alvarez fight, which I would kind of understand if Terence Bud Crawford did. But in my personal view, the best thing for Terence Bud Crawford to do, just in my personal view, is to try to go for complete undisputed in a third weight class at 154 pounds. Because in my personal view, the Canelo Alvarez fight, even though of course I can see why that fight has so much intrigue with that of a Terence Bud Crawford, especially because of the level of a Canelo Alvarez in terms of his resume and his greatness as a fighter. The thing is that in my view, there just really isn't that much appeal for that fight. And the reason why I say that is because Canelo Alvarez, in my view, is just going to be way too big. And on top of that, combined with his skill set, I just don't think that the fight is going to be relatively competitive. And on top of that, if Terence Bud Crawford ends up losing to Canelo Alvarez, everyone is pretty much going to say that Terence Bud Crawford was a 37-year-old welterweight fighter that never really should have been in the ring with him in the first place. Now, of course, has there been certain matchups like that in the past to where a fighter has been in the ring with a fighter and beat them, and they were probably about two weight classes, smaller than that fighter? Sure, like that of a Usyk or a Tyson Fury, or that overall of, a Mayweather versus Canelo very long ago. But I just don't think that this is going to be a fight that a lot of people are really going to want to see, just in my personal view. And a lot of people, of course, a lot of Terence Bud Crawford fans, they want to see this fight. But at the end of the day, once again, just in my personal view, if a fight does not have some sort of stakes for both fighters on the line, then in my view, it's really not that great of a fight. That's why I'm not really a super huge fan or a super huge supporter of a lot of these fights to where a fighter ends up jumping two weight classes out of nowhere, because more than likely that's going to damage their career very badly, because more than likely they're going to sustain a lot of damage. And on top of that, when it comes down to it, people aren't usually going to give that other fighter credit anyway, even if they do win, unless of course you're an exemplary fighter like Canelo when he fought Dimitri Bivol, and he really probably should have never been at that weight class in the first place. Or maybe if it's another situation. But at the end of the day, when it comes down to it, I just don't think that that's the good fight to happen. But anyways, let's see overall once again what these guys have to state. And they're not only going to be talking about Terence Crawford, but the fighters of this generation. And I always state this, but this is a very interesting generation when it comes to boxing, because I don't think that there's necessarily a confirmed number one pound for pound guy of this generation. Now, of course, many people may say that pretty much for every generation, you might be able to state that there's not a number one pound for pound guy of that generation. But especially in this generation, in my personal view, when you have a fighter like Canelo Alvarez, a fighter like Terence Bud Crawford, a fighter like Alexander Usyk, who do you necessarily rank as the best of that era? I'm not really quite sure. And of course, there's also Mr. Naoya Inoue as well. But Inoue is kind of a mix between overall, that generation and the newer generation, because he still has to do a little bit more for his career. But anyways, these guys are going to talk about it. Let's tune in.
Welcome into Boxing Scenes and Top Stories here on ProBox TV. Don't forget, download the ProBox TV app. Never fall behind in your boxing news. Also, the best way to see our Wednesday night fights. So, inflation is a big topic right now in this election year. Not only that, it has always happened in sports, but one thing that makes boxing unique is when a quarterback makes a lot more money and drives up the price of all the quarterbacks, still see him on Sunday. The idea that it might lead to inactivity in boxing. That's right. Eddie Hearn saying, quote, I don't think Crawford will ever fight again. That Terence Crawford, a lot of people's pound for pound king, will not fight.
Well, from what I've heard in recent news, apparently the Sebastian Fundora versus Terence Bud Crawford fight has been ordered next. And that would be a very particularly interesting fight because, of course, not only would that be for belts, but that that would be very interesting to see how Terence Bud Crawford would actually be able to deal with the size of a Sebastian Fundora. I mean, Sebastian Fundora is almost going to be a legit foot taller than that man. It's going to be very interesting. Now, of course, in terms of skills, I don't think that he's anywhere near Terence Bud Crawford in terms of the skill set. But in but in terms of overall, once again, the size and his type of style, it is going to be a little bit infuriating if Sebastian Fundora really comes on the offensive. But we'll see.
Because he is focused on a fight with Canelo Alvarez and won't accept.
And let me state this. Terence Bud Crawford's level of power did not appear to be the same to me at the 154-pound weight class. It definitely appeared overall like he had a harder time overall damaging his opponent, even though, of course, he still has, decent level power. He definitely did not seem to have that same level of destructive power in that last fight against Israel Madrimov. Now, who knows? Could that necessarily be overall because he moved up a weight class, or could it necessarily be because something was up with Terence Bud Crawford's gloves overall once again heading heading into the dressing room? Because once again, I'm not trying to spread anything, and I'm not trying to demean Terence Bud Crawford in any way. But I remember when Tyson Fury had that thing with Deontay Wilder, and a lot of these LDBC and new media channels were talking about it. But what's very interesting is that none of these channels were talking about how this is now the second time that Terence Bud Crawford has had some of his professionally sanctioned gloves broken and busted open on both occasions overall. Once against that, I believe, of David Avanesian, and once against Israel Madrimov. And all of a sudden they had to change his gloves out, and then all of a sudden it does not appear like Terence Bud Crawford has the same sledgehammer power anymore. So once again, was it because he moved up a weight class, or once again, could there maybe have been something a little bit extra in terms of his gloves, or something a little bit removed from his gloves? Who knows?
Anything less. Well, Canelo has shown no interest in that fight. So could the pound-for-pound king at 37 be stalled out in his career? Jimmy Smith in studio to help us answer the questions. Of course, Chris Algieri, Paulie Malignaggi, and ESPN boxing analyst Timothy Bradley. Chris, I'll start with you. Is Eddie Hearn just doing promoter stuff, or is there a real chance we won't see Terence Crawford again because of the inflated values caused by Turki Al-Sheikh in his mega fights?
Well, Eddie Hearn's always doing promoter stuff because he is a promoter. He wears that cap at all times. But I actually agree with Eddie on this one. I've been saying that for a while. To me, it seems like it's Canelo or bust for Crawford. And
I believe that more than likely, if you just ask me personally, I believe that more than likely that Terence Bud Crawford is going to fight a little bit more. I think that he still believes that there's something that he needs to be left behind in terms of being the definitive greatest fighter of this era. And I think that that's a part of the reason why he's going after Canelo Alvarez. Because I think that Terence Bud Crawford realizes that there's a lot of people that still kind of wonder or doubt overall once again a little bit about his resume. And he has, a better resume than what he once did, but it's not like Terence Bud Crawford has this super extensive resume like that of a Floyd Mayweather or a Manny Pacquiao or a Canelo Alvarez. He just doesn't. And I know that, a lot of people, they're going to take that as demeaning, but it just is what it is. At the end of the day, Terence Bud Crawford really only has about 5 A-grade level names on his resume. That's why I say that, it's just interesting when people say, especially like Aki TV and Dante's Boxing Nation, that he's automatically a top 5 to top 10 fighter of all time, and it's not even debatable. Well, I think that personally it's very debatable. Now, if you put Terence Bud Crawford up there, that's up to you. I don't necessarily have a problem with that, because I think overall that anyone that's undefeated for their era beats some of the fighters that they stated that they needed to beat. That's certainly a fighter that, of course, could be looked at as one of the top 10 fighters of all time, or certainly one of the top 20 fighters of all time. I don't really have a problem with that. But the thing is that Terence Bud Crawford, I just don't think that I can quite claim that he's on the same level as other fighters like that of a Muhammad Ali or a Floyd Mayweather or a Manny Pacquiao or a Roberto Duran, or, well, maybe around the same level as a Roberto Duran, but certainly not a Sugar Ray Leonard or Roy Jones Jr. I just don't know if I can quite compare him to those guys, because those guys, in my view, they just have too many big names in their pocket. It just is what it is. Terence Bud Crawford, it's really no offense against him, but once again, other than about 5 A-grade level fighters, I don't really see a whole bunch of other A-grade level fighters on his resume. It just is what it is, So it's whatever. And on top of that, Terence Bud Crawford moving up the weight classes, to be quite honest with you, 154 pounds is really the first weight division where I really ever thought that he was actually somewhat outsized. And Israel Madrimov is not really a fighter that actually outsizes him by that much. He's girthier and thicker than Terence Bud Crawford, of course. But combined with the reach advantage and the height that Terence Bud Crawford had over him, it really wasn't going to matter all that much.
I actually agree with Crawford as well. I think that with the stage that he's at.
Now, of course, if it was a Canelo Alvarez, someone who is going to be about probably 20 pounds or 15 pounds bigger than Crawford at least, then of course it's going to be a different situation. But when you talk about overall in Israel Madrimov, no, it's not going to be that much of a differential. And Crawford, from what I heard, actually rehydrated heavier than Madrimov. Now, once again, that doesn't always mean everything. Canelo Alvarez, I believe, rehydrated very similar or even heavier than Bivol. He kind of ballooned himself up in weight in order to kind of make it a little bit more of an even playing field. Jamel Charlo also did something very similar with Canelo Alvarez. Now, that being stated, Jamel Charlo and Canelo, actually, they're pretty much within the same weight class, because Canelo really does not belong at 168 and Charlo does not belong at 154. Both of those fighters really belong at 160 pounds. That's pretty much the only fight in recent years to where a fighter has moved up multitudes of weight classes or 2 weight classes, and I pretty much was able to give that fighter somewhat, not completely full credit, but, decent, credit overall to where, in my view, we had to blame the other fighter a little bit for not showing out as much, and it couldn't just be the weight, because Jamel Charlo had a little bit more size than what people are willing to admit.
In his career, in terms of legacy, he's done it all. There's not much more for him to accomplish in the sport. He's going to go down as the most accomplished fighter probably who's ever lived, especially in the four-belt era.
Well, I don't know if I can necessarily agree with that. I think that Terence Bud Crawford is going to go down as one of the most accomplished fighters, overall of all time. But the most accomplished fighter, that's when all of a sudden we have to have a different level of conversation. Because when we're talking about the most accomplished fighters, we're talking about Floyd Mayweather. We're talking about Manny Pacquiao. We're talking about Sugar Ray Leonard. We're talking about Roy Jones Jr. We're talking about maybe a Roberto Duran. We're talking about certain guys like that. Muhammad Ali. Those are the fighters that you're talking about. And not only did those guys, overall, once again, accomplish a great amount of things, but they did it over guys that would be looked at as A-grade level guys. Several fighters that could be looked at as A-grade. And that's the thing with Terence Bud Crawford. He definitely is very accomplished, but once again, his Terence Bud Crawford, and this is why I also said in my last video, and some person overall got offended by it because he said, how can you say that, certain black fighters, they experience black privilege overall? That's just something overall that's absolutely ridiculous. Every demographic and every race out there experiences some sort of privilege. No matter what sport or no matter what thing that we're talking about, we all experience some sort of level of privilege or some level of biasness, depending on overall what is pretty much perceived about us or what is put out there about us to a certain degree. When you talk about boxing, for example, once again, and this is how I responded to the comment, many Caucasian fighters, for example, if they put on a more defensive performance, they're not going to be called quote-unquote boring like what a black fighter would be, because a lot of the guys are trying to tear down certain black fighters. If you take a look at a Latin fighter, even if they're looked at a little bit more defensive, like that of a Canelo Alvarez, people will still take a look at them as more quote-unquote entertaining overall than that, say, of other fighters, that, let's say if they may be black fighters, that may have a little bit more of a knockout style, such as Deontay Wilder, when it comes down to it, or maybe some other guys. When you talk about, that of black fighters, they also can be looked at, sometimes as having a greater resume than what they actually may have because of the dominance of black American fighters throughout the sport's history, such as Muhammad Ali, Floyd Mayweather, blah, blah, blah. And that's why so many black dominant fighters, they're immediately compared to that of a Floyd Mayweather Jr., even when they're really not within that class. I remember when the Charlo brothers and also Demetrius Andrade were both compared to Floyd Mayweather Jr., and there's just no way in hell that you can compare any of those fighters to Floyd Mayweather, not only in terms of accomplishments, but really in terms of the skill set as well. So that's why, once again, we have to be very careful before we go too far with our ranking.
And he deserves the big time paydays. There was a long stretch of his career where he was not getting those huge paydays. And now at this point, at 37 years old, so I think he's gonna be 37 soon. At 37 years old, the type.
Because what I'll state is this: because a certain amount of Terence Bud Crawford fans, they may disagree with me overall and state that how can you say that Terence Bud Crawford, that overall that he is not debatably the most accomplished fighter of all time. The man is undisputed in 2 separate weight classes and blah blah blah. Okay, well, if we're going to go off of that point, does that make Alexander Usyk in a way also the most accomplished fighter of all time? Does that immediately make them within a top 10 fighter, spot of all time? All of a sudden, they'll be a little bit more tentative in terms to rank those guys so highly.
Fight that's going to get him up so he can go back to training camp and get back into that ring, it's got to be at the highest level. And when you are the top of the sport, the only thing higher is Canelo. And when we're talking about Canelo, you're talking about huge money. I just don't know if there's any other fights out there.
Well, Terence Bud Crawford isn't just in it for that fight for money. Terence Bud Crawford is in it for that fight because he realizes that if his name is ever going to be actually thrown in terms of the greatest of all time conversation, he's going to have to defeat someone like a Canelo Alvarez, because Crawford realizes that a lot of people do question his resume, and somewhat deservingly so. It isn't that Terence Bud Crawford hasn't necessarily fought some of the names that people have asked him to, of course, but it's just, a little bit unfortunate because Terence Bud Crawford, although he could have signed with the PBC way earlier, that cost him a lot of time in terms of not facing a lot of the top-level names. If Crawford would have fought that of a Kell Brook when he was looked at as a championship-level fighter, or if he would have fought Danny Garcia or Sean Porter, Sean Porter, to be fair, was still an A-grade level fighter, just not a champion when he fought him, when it came down to it, If he would have fought Danny Garcia, if he would have fought some of those other guys, Keith Thurman on the PBC, his career could be looked at as a little bit different right now.
Would really interest Crawford, one, in terms of getting up for the fight in order to go to training camp, and two, to pay the ticket price that he deserves at this point of his career.
But, Paulie, when you look at it, do you see how Chris sees it, which is essentially a unique problem to Terence Crawford in his career, that just where he is, there's not all places to go? Or is it because of the hyperinflation in boxing caused by big cards and big paydays? We saw this a little bit with PBC when they were spending huge money. It really pushed up the rates, and we saw kind of a dip in boxing afterward. Is this a Terence Crawford problem, or is it a payment problem?
Jimmy, that's a great question to pose. I think with Crawford's situation, it's not necessarily the inflation of the sport. I think some of that has always a little bit to do with things. But in Crawford's situation, he's in a unique spot. Most people will never be world champions in boxing, let alone the number one pound-for-pound fighter in the world.
Well, the thing also with Mr. Terence Bud Crawford is this. And, once again, certain channels are not going to be willing to talk about this, or they don't want to talk about this because, once again, they get the racial motivations up, and overall, once again, they want to make it seem like overall, like every black fighter is a star. And not every single black fighter, nor not every single fighter is a star. Terence Bud Crawford is a star in terms of his boxing ability. But in terms of overall, once again, of his money revenue and his ability overall, once again, to bring in people and sell tickets, he's just not a star. It is what it is, at least not a superstar. He's a star per se, but he's not necessarily a superstar. Because pretty much every event overall that we've heard of Terence Bud Crawford being involved in, we have pretty much heard about it either losing money or underwhelming in terms of the pay-per-view numbers. It just is what it is. So once again, overall, Terence Bud Crawford, a big part of the reason overall why also there may be a little bit of an issue is because Terence Bud Crawford, he's just not an elite caliber boxing superstar. Now, in terms of boxing ability, yes, of course, he's a superstar. But in terms of overall, once again, the ability to market him, no, he's not a superstar.
Crawford has done both of those things, and he is currently in that position now. So I think when it comes to that point, and as the champ Chris mentioned, he's maybe the most accomplished fighter we've seen in a four-belt era. It leads to some questions where are you going to put yourself at risk for lesser money, or at least the average kind of money you've made before? Now you start to taste a little bit of money. You start to taste that turkey out cheek money, and really the only thing that can satisfy both your hunger for legacy and finances is the Canelo fight. It's at a certain point when you've accomplished everything. Chris, you mentioned, you go for Canelo. Yeah, you could go for the biggest money possible, really, and in the realistic sense. And that is Canelo. And I think if he can't get that, there's nothing really that's going to tickle his fancy. There's nothing really that's going to get him motivated. As a matter of fact,
well, in my personal view, if Terence Bud Crawford really wants to set himself apart from almost everybody else, the only other fighter that's really ever going to have an opportunity to become undisputed in 3 separate weight classes, at least more than likely of this generation, is going to be that of Mr. Naoya Inoue. That's going to be the only other fighter of this generation that's going to be looked at as possibly as accomplished as a Terence Bud Crawford. If Crawford goes for undisputed at 154, he can become the first and so far the only fighter to ever become undisputed in 3 separate weight classes. So in my view, that would be the move if I'm Terence Bud Crawford, to try and set myself aside from everybody else. But I think that Terence Bud Crawford, once again, I think he wants the Canelo fight because that's really going to be the fight to where he realizes to where if he beats Canelo Alvarez, people are going to be talking about him in the same breaths as the Floyd Mayweather, as a Manny Pacquiao, as Muhammad Ali, as those guys. They're going to be talking about him with those guys, Sugar Ray Leonard, Roy Jones Jr., Rocky Marciano, whoever you put within your top 10, Chavez, Duran, whoever the hell you put up there.
These fights at 154 pounds that are way more risky and pay a fraction of what Canelo would pay. Even maybe a fraction of what Crawford's already made in his career. So it's really it leaves him in a position where he's sort of become too great for his own good, and there's nothing really left to accomplish except try to get the biggest cash cow possible. And in this situation, the biggest cash cow possible is actually kind of beatable too. So usually it's like you look at it like, it's a cash out fight. Not necessarily with Canelo. It's not necessarily just the cash out fight. It's the cash out fight that gives you the legacy, the money, and everything else added on top of what you've already done. And that's hard.
Well, once again, let me state this very quickly. And we all know that Paulie has a little bit of an issue with that at Canelo Alvarez. But if you're one of these guys that states that you believe that Terence Bud Crawford has a great chance over Canelo Alvarez, I don't have a problem with that. But once again, then that means that if Canelo Alvarez pitches a shutout against Terence Bud Crawford, because Crawford is still undefeated and looked at as debatably the #1 pound-for-pound fighter, if Canelo pitches a shutout over Terence Bud Crawford, then we need to give Canelo Alvarez some credit. We need to put some stakes with him on the line as well. We can't just have this one-sided bullshit to where we want to talk about all this shit about how Canelo Alvarez is this limited fighter compared to Terence Bud Crawford, and we want this fight to happen, but, Crawford is going to get all the credit in the world if he wins, but Canelo's not going to get anything if he ends up winning. It just can't be like that. Once again, if you want that fight to happen, no problem whatsoever. But then overall, put some stakes on the line for both of them, not just one.
To double, that's a difficult situation to kind of replace when that's the only situation you kind of put yourself into due to, let's face it, due to his greatness, really.
Tim, when you look at it, everybody on this panel right now, you guys all won world titles. You're some of the best of your era in boxing. Tim, can I ask you to put your fan hat on for 1 second?
Well, Timothy Bradley is looked at as one of the best of his era. I mean, Chris Algieri, he was a champion. He ended up winning it, I believe, over Ruslan Provodnikov. Chris Algieri was a decent fighter. Paulie Malignaggi, of course, he was a multiple weight division champion. But I mean, best fighters of their era. I mean, I suppose, all of them were champions. I'll at least give them that.
Everybody sings from a boxing perspective about legacy and the money he could make, but are the fans kind of missing out? Who some of them maybe just getting to know Terence Crawford at a big fight in his last few fights that want to see more of him? Are they kind of left out in the cold if he does decide to walk away rather than fight someone other than Canelo?
Look, let me put it like this. Once Canelo's gone, once Crawford decides to hang him up, once Inoue decides to hang him up, I mean, who do we have to hold on to, guys? Like, who's that next coming? Who's going to be the next Canelo? Like, we're missing that, man. So, like, while Crawford is here, let's continue to...
Well, that's for the new and upcoming stars like Shakur Stevenson, Gervonta Tank Davis, Devin Haney, Ryan Garcia, Teofimo Lopez, Jesse Bam Bam Rodriguez. Those are for those fighters to figure out. I'm not really sure who's going to take over the heavyweight division. We'll have to see on that one, but that's for those fighters to figure out. For every overall, once again, it's kind of like overall that of certain teeth, just like overall when one falls out, it's going to get replaced usually with another one, at least overall, depending on the animal or depending on the time period, of course, for a human that you're talking about. But anyways, when it comes down to it overall, boxing is pretty much like a crocodile jaw, which is a weird comparison. But a crocodile, basically, overall, they can replace their teeth pretty much overall for a lifetime. Whenever overall that one tooth falls out, whenever that one participant falls out, another one is going to take its place, overall very soon. So once again, Canelo Alvarez and, those guys, this era, of course, is defined by Usyk and Crawford and Canelo and, of course, and probably that I'm missing in a way, but all of them will have their replacements eventually.
Give him his flowers. While Canelo is here, let's continue to give him his flowers because once they're gone, man, boxing's going to be kind of dead. I'm not going to lie. It's going to...
Well, I don't think that it's going to be quote-unquote dead. It's just that overall it's going to be in a time to where it clearly has shifted over to the next generation. And this next generation is going to be owned by guys, once again, by Shakur Stevenson, Devin Haney, Ryan Garcia, if he continues, maybe Teofimo Lopez, guys like Gervonta Tank Davis, maybe Bruce Shoo Shoo Carrington, or whatever his name is, other fighters like that. And I'm sure there's a bunch of other younger talent that I'm not thinking of. Jesse Bam Bam Rodriguez. If, of course, Inoue does not end up defeating him, if they end up getting in a colossal fight, we'll see. Once again, it'll be interesting.
Be kind of dead. Usyk already came out and said,
Tim, guys like Canelo, the reason for that, though, you're not letting other guys get their shot at becoming stars. You're just holding it for yourself, and guys don't really get to grow. Benavidez, had he fought Canelo 2 years ago, would have beat him, and then you.
And, of course, how could I forget about Mr. David Benavidez, depending on how long he lasts.
You have that start growing for the last 2 years. Instead, you don't.
You don't know that. Paulie, you don't know that for a fact that he would have beat him. You don't know that for a fact.
You really think Canelo beats Benavidez?
No, but I'm just saying, Paulie, you don't know that for a fact. I think that Canelo beats Benavidez right now. I think he beats Benavidez. But I don't think.
I agree that we don't know for a fact that David Benavidez beats Canelo Alvarez. But on the flip side, we also don't know for a fact that Canelo beats David Benavidez either. And it's very apparent that Canelo Alvarez, that he realizes that David Benavidez is a very, very big threat to him. And that on top of that, he also realizes something else. That David Benavidez is meant to be his replacement. That's what David Benavidez is meant to be. So they've already been building up David Benavidez pretty much as the replacement for Canelo Alvarez. Now, do I think that he'll probably be as big of a star as Canelo? More than likely not, because I don't think that he has the skill set nor the appeal as a Canelo Alvarez, and on top of that, I don't think that he's going to be a multiple weight division champion, at least if Bivol or Better Beef get a hold of him. But, once again, we'll see overall what ends up happening.
But I don't think Canelo believes that he can. No, on the real. But I'm just saying, man, you got Usyk is saying he got 2 more fights, and he's out.
And Paulie, I don't know overall what Canelo Alvarez did to Paulie Malignaggi. I'm not sure overall what Canelo did to Paulie, but something is up. Something is up Paulie's ass whenever Canelo Alvarez is a part of the conversation.
Game. So, right now Crawford is, again, he's done accomplishing belts, man. 2-time undisputed champion. He wants the big money fight. He wants to sell off, get that big money fight against Canelo Alvarez, and then retire. But if he can't get the Canelo fight, what? I mean, what else is there to do in boxing? He's already accomplished everything you can do in boxing, if not the #1 spot as well. So why continue? Why continue to take the damage? Crawford don't have to work a day in his life, guys. I'm letting y'all know he is perfectly fine. If he chooses to fight, then we can. Hey, you know what? Let's support him. But if he doesn't choose to fight, he doesn't need boxing to sustain his lifestyle. He is perfectly fine.
He's never gonna have to work a day in his life. His kids are.
It's very true overall that Terence Crawford will never have to work another day in his life, more than likely, and that more than likely that he's pretty much accomplished everything that a boxer pretty much needs to. But if Terence Crawford, this at least would be my advice to him. And of course, I'm not a professional boxer and I'm not his advisor, and I'm not saying overall that he has to take my advice or that I'm a pro advisor necessarily. But before you really think about hanging him up, because you're 37 years old, you're not really going to have that much more time. If you really wanted to set yourself as debatably the clear greatest fighter of this era, then overall, in my view, you are going to have to do something that is quote-unquote legendary, or something to where it pretty much is going to set you apart from almost everybody else. And in my personal view, being undisputed in 3 separate weight classes, that is going to be that thing. That is going to be the thing that is really going to make him special. Of course, this is the era of the 2-weight undisputed, champions. Usyk, Inoue, and that of Terence Crawford. But of course, if Crawford can become undisputed in 3 separate weight classes, that's going to be something that Canelo Alvarez, nor Usyk, and possibly even Inoue can ever do, depending on how successful Inoue will be at 126 pounds. Because I'm not quite sure how successful he's going to be, because some of those guys are going to be very relatively big compared to him. But we'll see.
Not going to have to work. But as good as he is, he never had that generational money fight.
Yeah.
A guy like Canelo's grandkids would have to fight.
Well, it was supposed to be against Errol Spence Jr., but once again, that just goes to further prove Terence Crawford is not a superstar. That, once again, every pay-per-view that Terence Crawford has been in, it pretty much is underwhelmed. So if you're talking about having a big pay-per-view money fight, he would need someone like Canelo Alvarez.
Like he's made so much money.
Because once again, no offense against Mr. Terence Crawford, but for that fight being quote-unquote the fight of the decade, that fight couldn't even do 900,000 pay-per-view buys. Canelo Alvarez did that with Caleb Plant just a few years ago.
Terence hasn't been able to touch that, and he deserves it. And that's my point about anything, whatever the ticket price is, that guy should get it. And it's unfortunate it took so long for the public to realize his greatness and to see him where he's at, but he doesn't have the dance partner. So I understand where he's at, where he's like, listen, it's Canelo or bust, because like you said, Paulie, those other fights that are around, they're risky and they're not going to pay. Canelo pays. Does Crawford need to do anything else? I think we all agree, no. He's done it all. He is the man. He's the pound for pound king. But in terms of the kind of money that he deserves to have made, he hasn't made that yet. So if that Canelo fight is still dangling, I understand why he's hanging around. And Canelo's sitting there deciding he's going to do this on a whim anyway. He's still he's starting to kick back a little bit and be like, that fight could happen. Yeah. So of course Crawford's going to sit back and be like, all right, well now this guy thinks this fight can happen, so I got to stay ready.
And I could definitely see the appeal for Canelo Alvarez of that fight, but I could also see why he's not too appealed with that fight. But Canelo is going to have to believe overall that he's going to have to get some sort of credit in order of beating Terence Bud Crawford. He's not just going to take that fight if he believes that he's not going to get any credit whatsoever. It just is what it is, But Canelo Alvarez, once again, he could appeal to that fight because that could be his way of somewhat saying that Terence Bud Crawford is not on my level and that I was the greater fighter than him because I ended up pretty much beating him to a pulp. That could be, Canelo Alvarez's way of basically stating that I am better than that of a Terence Bud Crawford. Now, of course, a lot of people would state, well, Crawford, he was moving up a couple weight classes anyways, so, of course, that was to be expected. Right, but Canelo Alvarez also is not a natural 168-pounder. That being stated, I don't think that Crawford is a natural 154-pounder. But that being stated, overall, once again, it would be a middleweight versus a welterweight in my personal view. But if Canelo Alvarez once again were to win that fight, at least he could somewhat state that I'm better than Crawford, at least in his mind.
Tough situation for Crawford.
Yeah, in Canelo's situation, he's the one that said, last week or 2 weeks ago, when they were talking about the Crawford fight, the Crawford and Fundora mandatory being called or something like that. He's like, well, that fight might not necessarily happen. Why would it happen unless he's talking about that he might fight Canelo? Obviously, maybe Crawford's not going to take it anyway. I think that's a very winnable fight for Crawford, the Fundora fight, but it may not tickle his fancy.
Well, it's a very winnable fight, but what I will state is this. That's going to be an interesting fight because Fundora is a tall bastard. That dude overall, once again, he's relatively powerful. He's very big. He's very lengthy. But of course, he would also have to have a great amount of confidence against that of a Terence Bud Crawford. He would have to really throw within that fight because he's not going to win that fight any other way.
It's kind of like a been there, done that kind of thing. It's hard to, I tell you, when you got those silk pajamas, like Marvin Hagler said, it's hard to get motivated. What can get Crawford motivated? And that's Canelo. Really, these Fundora kind of fights, he's won that level of fight already. He's got those kind of belts already. It's only the Canelo fight for him.
Guys, it's a simple yes or no. I'm very curious about this, gentlemen. Take a survey of this panel. Do you think he fights again? Terence Crawford, start with you, Chris. Go.
I said no. I've been saying that for months. I think if it's Canelo or bust for me.
Baldy, what do you think?
I think he fights Canelo. I said 2 years ago that Canelo would never fight David Benavidez. I am right. I'm going to be right again. Canelo and Crawford will be made.
You heard the confidence, Tim. What do you think?
I think he fights again, and I agree with Paulie. I think he fights Canelo Alvarez. I think that
I would like to see Terence Bud Crawford fight Sebastian Fundora later in the year. But of course, we'll see once again if that fight's going to happen, and we'll also see if Fundora versus Errol Spence is going to happen first. Because there's been rumors overall that fight's going to happen, but we'll see. I wouldn't be surprised whatsoever if Canelo versus Crawford happens.
There's things that's moving, things that's been said in the background that we don't know of. I think he fights Canelo.
You heard it. Our panel says either he doesn't fight or it is Canelo or bust. Big payday. We all understand. I got to say, from sitting behind this desk, must be nice to call your shots like that. Just like we call the shots when it comes to boxing news. Once again, download the app, ProBox TV, and get it now. And get ready for Canelo in 2 weeks. The money man. Don't forget. He's the...
But anyways, that pretty much is about it for today. Of course, Canelo Alvarez, he fights next week against that of Edgar Berlanga, which, is going to be a relatively interesting card. Not necessarily because I think that Edgar Berlanga is a great quality fighter, but of course, it's still going to be interesting. And on top of that, it has some great undercards as well, such as Araceli Lara versus Danny Garcia. But we'll see what happens. That pretty much is about it for today. Thank you all so much for watching. I'll talk to y'all later.